Success was by no means certain. Not until July 1801 was agreement reached, and then only after several near breakdowns, angry ultimatums from the First Council, and foot dragging by French ministers who included the arch apostate and ex-bishop Talleyrand and the priest turned fervent de-Christianizer Fouché. There were also serious misgivings within the College of Cardinals, yet the Concordat, as eventually agreed, was far from the dictated peace which Bonaparte was able to impose in that year on France's secular adversaries. It began by facing facts. Catholicism was the religion of the majority of the French. Papal negotiators had wished it to be accepted as dominant, the religion of the state. And when a parallel agreement covering France's Italian satellites was worked out in subsequent years, that was agreed. But in France, there was hundreds of thousands of Protestants, and who knew how many skeptical disciples of Voltaire. To them, the freedom of belief and worship proclaimed by the revolution was fundamental. And the first consul thought so too. It was reiterated in the Concordat's first article. Even so, a state church was set up. The Catholic clergy would be paid out of the public purse and appointed via the bishops by the government. Bishops, as under the old order, would be designated by the head of state and invested only with their spiritual authority by the Pope. They and their clergy would take an oath of obedience to the government. In this way, by an agreement with the Pope, the consulate secured what the National Assembly had been unable to achieve unilaterally and without consultation. A church organized according to the same principles as the state. In 1790, clergy were to be elected like secular officials. In 1801, bishops became clerical prefects. Under both regimes, there was a close, though not entirely identical, correspondence between civil and ecclesiastical geography. A defeat, then, for royalist dreams of restoring the full panoply of the old regime church. and equally a defeat for the Jacobin doctrine of complete separation between church and state. The survivors of the much maligned constitutional church, now calling itself by the historic title of Gallican, and allowed to convene a council of 40 bishops in Notre Dame in June of 1801 to show their strength, could believe themselves vindicated from the exile in which all but a handful of them still lived. Refractory prelates feared that Bonaparte, in restoring the altars, would prefer to hand them over to a clergy which had never renounced the revolution. But in fact, at the same time as he had refused to discuss challenging the land settlement, the first consul had demanded another precondition from the Pope. All existing bishops, constitutional or refractory, must be deprived. Any settlement must have a completely fresh beginning. The Pope made no objection, for to make such a request was to acknowledge that he had powers which no secular ruler had ever before recognized. Once agreement was reached, they were invoked by the brief Tom Multa. He appealed to all refractory bishops to surrender their powers to him. Of the 93 surviving, 55 obeyed, as they had obeyed his predecessor's injunction to reject the civil constitution of the clergy. Those refusing, he deprived, since Rome had never recognized the legitimacy of constitutional ordinations. No such measures were required in the case of the constitutional church. Bonaparte did what was necessary, ordering their consul to disperse unacknowledged. The Pope was shocked, however, when he went on to nominate 12 constitutionals to the new bench, all but 2 of whom refused to retract the oath they had taken in 1790. And greater shocks were still to come. By the 77 organic articles added unilaterally to the Concordat just prior to its promulgation in April 1802, the power of the Pope to communicate with the French clergy was circumscribed even more closely than under the Gallican days before 1789. Louis XIV's 4 anti-papal Gallican articles of 1682 were once more to be taught in all schools and seminaries. But by now, as the first consul had calculated, Pius VII recognized that it was too late to imperil the whole settlement by quibbling, however important the issues. No doubt many of them could be cleared up later. Other provisions, anyway, were positively welcome, such as the final abandonment of the Decadi in favor of Sunday. All, in any case, paled into insignificance beside the fact that free exercise of the faith in France had been restored. The hierarchy was back in place, and the authority of the papacy had received far more fulsome recognition from the heirs of a godless revolution than ever it had won from the most Christian kings of the old regime. Nothing the first council had done was more controversial. To many, the reestablishment of the church seemed a renunciation of all that the revolution had stood for, or, as one disgusted general put it, all that 100,000 men had died for. But yet a further revolutionary legacy would be cast aside before the law on cults of 18 Germinal, year 10, which comprised both the Concordat and the Organic Articles, was passed. The last vestiges of free parliamentary life were stifled in the purge of the tribunate and legislative body of January 1801, nominated by CS and the Senate in December 1799. The members of these bodies were chosen for their likely pliancy, but they were not non-entities. Only 47 out of 400 had not sat before in any of the various revolutionary assemblies. So they were familiar with the deliberative procedures and the ways of legislatures, and found it hard to accept that their only function was to endorse what the first consul had decided. Nor had this been the intention of CS in drafting the Constitution. Now, disgruntled at the turn of events, he encouraged his friends in the tribunate to criticize proposed legislation openly, to Bonaparte's increasing irritation. His critics in the tribunate, the first consul declared, were abstract metaphysicians who deserved drowning. He would not, he warned, let himself be defied by Louis the 16th, a pregnant comparison. Even the consolidation of his position after Marengo, or the wave of obvious public relief when he survived the Infernal Machine assassination attempt, failed to mute their criticisms. By the spring of 1801, it is true, only 6 bills had been rejected, and another 6 withdrawn. But much more vigorous opposition was feared in the session of the year 10, 1801 to 1802, when the Concordat would need to be enacted as a law of the state. When the Houses convened in November, even some of the victorious peace treaties laid before them attracted carping, while measures to expedite the drafting of the civil code ran into what the head of state regarded as malicious obstruction. When the tribunate nominated for the Senate Donneau, a constitutional authority who had led opposition to a bill to set up special tribunals to deal with rural brigandage, he took it as a deliberate challenge. He felt he must act before the Concordat was discussed. The studied obscurity of the Constitution was now invoked to good effect. It stipulated that the membership of the 2 houses should be renewed in the year 10, but neither how nor precisely when. This was therefore declared as good a moment as any, and the Senate was ordered to conduct the operation by naming those who would remain members. 60 names were by this means dropped from the legislative body and 20 from the tribunate. There was no resistance, and within a few months, many of those eliminated had been found official positions elsewhere. Public reaction to this first legislative purge since Brumaire is hard to gauge. By this time, the independent press had largely disappeared, but police reports suggested that all cafe talk in Paris was on the First Consul's side and contemptuous of functionaries who represented nobody and yet constantly bit the hand that fed them. The main source of public concern was now reported to be the safety of the First Consul's life, a far surer guarantee of stability and order than the antics of politicians whose incapacity, more than a decade of upheaval and uncertainty, had vividly demonstrated. In this atmosphere, the Concordat was at last presented to the legislature between 5 and 8th of April, as news of the Peace of Amiens was trumpeted throughout the country. It was not quite unopposed, but it passed overwhelmingly. Over the next 2 months, a whole series of new measures would also be presented to reorganize education, to create a new Legion of Honor, and to extend the first consul's term of office. Before the year was out, Bonaparte would be consul for life, and France would almost have a king again. Meanwhile, however, April 1802 was to be a month of celebration. It culminated on the 18th, Easter Day, with a solemn mass to mark the resurrection of the Catholic Church in France. It was held in Notre Dame in the presence of the first consul, the entire government, and the diplomatic corps. The preacher was the 70-year-old Bourgogne, once Archbishop of Aix, now of Tours, a nobleman of old stock. He had delivered the sermon at the coronation of Louis XVI. As then, he celebrated a new beginning. But the jubilant crowds who thronged Paris that day, thrilled by the boom of cannon and the ringing of bells silent since 1793, and the people of quality who lit their windows when night fell, were not thinking about what the future might bring. With the end of the war, the elimination of political strife, and the restoration of political freedom, they were celebrating the burial of the revolution. Chapter 17, The Revolution in Perspective. The Revolutionary War, terminated by the treaties of Lunéville and Amiens, had been a far more total conflict than anything previously known. Among other things, polite travelers were shocked to discover that what they could no longer go freely to countries with which their own was at war. None felt the change more keenly than the British, who for much of the 1790s found themselves cut off by French power from most of Western Europe. The conclusion of the peace reopened the continent to them, and in 1802 thousands of them swarmed across the Channel to visit the scene of the revolution and see for themselves what George III and his ministers had been fighting against. I had conceived an horrific idea of the populace of this country, wrote Fanny Burney, married, it is true, to an émigré when she arrived at Calais in April, imagining them all transformed into bloody monsters. She found them nothing of the sort. But then, the economy of Calais had been devastated by the interruption of the Dover ferries, and the inhabitants were glad to see rich British tourists passing through again, posting towards Paris in the hope of catching a glimpse of the fascinating hero who had brought the revolution to an end. He was not yet the Corsican ogre he was to become in British demonology. The first thing these sightseers noticed was the roads. The highways that in 1787 had left Arthur Young awestruck were now pitted and neglected. Everywhere, too, were ruins and boarded-up buildings, defunct monasteries and convents, and abandoned aristocratic chateaux. Although, passing as they were through devout Flanders and Picardy, travelers noticed congregations flocking to Mass on Sunday in their best linen. They often found larger churches pillaged and dilapidated. Rouen Cathedral, noted one gentleman arriving from Le Havre, was blackened and dingy from being used as a gunpowder factory. The tricolor was everywhere, and few people were seen without the national cockade. But evidence of changing orthodoxies could be seen on public buildings, where the slogan "Liberty, Equality, Humanity, Fraternity, or Death" was inscribed, with the last two thinly painted out. Royal arms and insignia, needless to say, were everywhere defaced or obscured, and at Versailles the palace was deserted. "Who could, without emotion," wrote one visitor, "behold the windows broken and barred up, the doors falling off their hinges, the grass waving in the courtyards, where formerly a weed was never seen, and where all was gaiety and splendor." Arriving in Paris, however, those who had known it before the great upheaval found it less changed than expected. The Bastille had gone, its site converted into a wood yard. Those who visited the Tuileries in the hope of seeing the first consul now installed there could hire guides who would point out the bloodstains left when the Swiss guards had been massacred in 1792. There were far fewer rich private carriages in the streets, and any number of bits of furniture or other battered relics of aristocratic or pious living could be bought from street dealers. But the great city was as animated as ever, and the Palais Royal was, if anything, more crowded than when Arthur Young had visited it during the ferment of 1789. Nobody, though, was talking politics there. It had become a rather frenetic pleasure garden, and was only one among several. rich, fashionable society was on parade again, as in monarchical times, and the well-policed streets were agreed to be a good deal safer. Military parades and reviews, not surprisingly, in a country ruled by a general, were an almost daily spectacle. Such were the visible fruits of 13 years of turmoil, symptoms, some of temporary disruption, others of permanent and irrevocable change. Almost none, however, reflected what reformers had aimed for and dreamed of as they set about national regeneration in the heady spring of 1789. For at the beginning, the impetus of the French Revolution had been intellectual far more than social or economic. Enriched and enormously expanded by 3 generations of widening prosperity, the leisured classes of France had invested their gains in culture, which meant above all education. And while the clergymen, at whose feet they all sat, tried hard to mold their minds into habits of orthodoxy and obedience, even by denouncing it, they introduced their charges to the progress which independent thinking achieved since the Reformation. By the mid-18th century, an educated, critical public opinion was emerging, and expanding market for ideas which writers of all shades of opinion sought to engage, and which government itself was increasingly to court. Loss of public confidence underlay the financial and political crisis which precipitated the downfall of a system of government too little changed in its habits and priorities since the days of Louis XIV. Surprise at the rapid collapse of a state whose ambitions had outstripped its means was universal. Nobody had expected it or prepared for it, for all their disillusionment with existing ways and institutions. But once the crumbling away of the old absolute monarchy began to look irreversible, in the course of 1788, men began to turn their minds towards what to put in its place. With the calling of the Estates General and the drafting of cahiers that preceded it, the whole of France, far beyond the educated elite, was invited to consider this question too. Suddenly, anything seemed possible. Any abuse seemed remediable. any grievance capable of redress, any old score within reach of settlement. The message was change, and it thrilled men of education far beyond the borders of France. Here was an opportunity for enlightened men to bring about a more rational, just, and humane organization of the affairs of mankind. And enlightened men seized it. The National Assembly, which launched the revolution, included the cream of the country's intelligentsia. Who consciously saw themselves as the products and the instruments of the triumph of enlightenment. All over France, men of similar background rallied to them, inspired by the same ideals. The spontaneous proliferation of the Jacobin clubs, with their high-minded commitment to the rights of man and the citizen, reflected this inspiration. Among some of them, although a dwindling minority as the revolutionary years went on, it never died. And in many respects, the labors of France's revolutionaries did introduce greater rationality and logic into the country's affairs on a permanent basis. The administrative reorganization in 2 departments, sweeping away the jurisdictional jungle grown up over a millennium, survives not much altered to this day. The metric and decimal system, superseding another prescriptive nightmare, was introduced after 5 years of elaboration in April 1795. It has swept the world since. Scarcely less successful has been the civil code, that succinct, lucid compendium dreamed and talked of for generations before 1789. Although it took the authority and determination of the first consul to bring it to fruition, drafting had begun during the Revolution's first impulse in 1790. The barbarities and inequities of the old criminal law disappeared permanently. The guillotine proved less of a success, although it might have won more recognition as the humane refinement it was meant to be: quick, reliable, and by all calculation, painless. Had it not become the main public instrument of terror. Yet, in some ways, it was curiously appropriate that it should. For most of those it dispatched were deemed to be resisting, for reasons no rational man could accept as valid. Other changes, equally dictated by logic, equity, and humanity. It was resistance that made the revolution violent. It was naive of the men of 1789 to think that they could regenerate the nation without opposition, and imagine that the honesty and benevolence of their intentions would be as obvious to others as to themselves. But the Enlightenment had never been afraid to impute ignorance, superstition, and selfishness to its opponents. And its disciples entirely shared this cast of mind. Critics who trace the spirit of terror back to 1789, because even then the Patriots had not hesitated to use intimidation to get their way, were therefore not entirely wrong. "Shut up, bad citizen," yelled a spectator who threw himself upon Malouet from the gallery on 15 June 1789 as he criticized proposals to declare a national assembly. A month later, Barnave was publicly defending the lynching of Foulon and Berthier. It was true that in 1789, royal resistance to the formation of a national assembly could probably not have been overcome without the threat of bloodshed. But the very success of patriotic defiance set an example of how to deal with future challenges. Even after the nation had been sickened with public carnage, politicians still found it impossible to accept the legitimacy and good faith of their opponents. In the end, it took a general who openly despised intellectuals to make them sink their differences in the interests of stability. first resistance to change came from the nobility. Their powers and prerogatives thrown into relief by resort to an Estates General where their representatives sat as a separate order. By the end of 1788, they found themselves isolated and under attack. This attack had been launched by an intellectual coterie, the Society of 30, who deliberately exploited social tensions within the educated elite to marshal overwhelming public support for an undivided legislature. Frightened, many nobles took refuge in their privileges, thus exacerbating the antagonism and mistrust towards them now rampant among the bourgeoisie. The original issue was still unresolved when the estates convened. And by the time it was settled, months of anti-noble rhetoric had cast a whole social category into intransigent opponents of national regeneration. This they had certainly never been until then. Their cahiers showed an impressive willingness to contemplate reform and surrender many of their most valuable privileges. But by now, nothing would satisfy patriots but the surrender of them all. Aristocracy became the revolution's most telling term of abuse and disapproval, describing all who opposed it. Equality, a situation where nobody enjoyed any privileges based on unfair criteria such as birth or ancestry, became one of its driving aspirations. Even Napoleon paid it constant lip service, and, though of noble birth himself, and educated in a military academy reserved for the sons of poor gentry, always gloried in being a product of the revolution's opening careers to talent. Nobles were therefore the first and the greatest losers from the revolution. Even before it began, they had agreed to sacrifice their tax exemptions and fiscal privileges. Almost from the start, they lost the deference and preference to which they had been accustomed since time immemorial. Years later, it would creep back. And it still lingers today. But never since 1789 has it been automatic or unchallengeable. In June of that year, they lost the right to separate political representation and corporate powers. A fleeting enough advantage, it is true, since with the exception of a few paid dictat, it had only existed when the Estates General were in being. In August, their material losses began with the abolition of feudalism. They were by no means the only beneficiaries from feudal rights, dues, honors, and prerogatives, but their stake in the system was indisputably the greatest. Relics of feudal levies lingered in remote corners far into the 19th century. But to all intents and purposes, feudalism and the profits lords made from it had disappeared forever by 1794. The night of 4th August also transformed the character of the French nobility, hitherto an open elite within the elite, accessible to new money invested in ennobling offices. The abolition of venal office turned it for the first time into a caste. Ennoblement ceased. Within a year, nobility itself had ceased to be recognized, and the display of arms and insignia was forbidden. But nobility itself could not be abolished. Defined as an hereditary quality, it was in the blood, or at least in the minds of those who thought they possessed it. Another instance, though this seemed to enlightened men of human ignorance and superstition, revolutionary policies drove many nobles from a country they no longer recognized as their own. At least 16,500 immigrated during the revolution, and probably several thousand more lost to statistics through various anomalies. The property of those who refused to return or who were executed was confiscated, depriving perhaps 12,500 families of all or some of their land. Many, however, managed to buy some of it back, immediately or later by gradual stages. And long before 1799, émigrés were cautiously returning. Soon enough, the Emperor Napoleon would create a new nobility, and to give it tone, was anxious to leaven it with as many ci devants as possible. All he demanded was solid landed wealth in addition. But they had no difficulty in showing evidence of that. In most departments under the empire, the ranks of the highest taxpayers were completely noble dominated. The material losses of the nobility, therefore, were neither as great nor as irrevocable as might be imagined, but they were still traumatic enough. And the process by which they occurred was truly harrowing. As triumph persistently eluded the counter-revolution, immigration proved a life of disappointment, bitterness, and poverty. Separated perhaps forever from my family, lamented the Marquis de Felicieux as 1793 dawned. Proscribed, a wanderer outlawed from my country, no longer possessing anything, far from all I knew and loved in my childhood. From my days of happiness, I saw around me nothing but distress and no hope for the future at all. Hundreds of the menfolk of such ladies perished when they attempted to return in force at Quiberon or on other battlefields. For those who never left there was constant suspicion. Although only 1,200 or so nobles were executed in the terror, many more were imprisoned for months on end as suspects. And in 1797, just when circumstances seemed to be easing, they were deprived of civil rights merely for being nobles, and almost found themselves deported en masse for the same reason. Such tribulations bred a bitter hatred and contempt for the revolution and all it stood for in noble circles. Although former nobles were to be found active in the public life of France during every phase of the revolutionary years, it was a far cry from the monopoly they had enjoyed before 1789, and nothing like those days would ever return. Many nobles now ostentatiously turned their backs on public life as beneath their dignity. The psychological impact, in other words, was far more serious than the material one for nobles and non-nobles alike. The bonds of subordination are so loosened everywhere, complained the Count de Villèle, minister of a restored monarchy in 1826. The evil is in our manners, so influenced are we still by the revolution. The first attacks of the revolution on the clergy passed almost unresisted. In the more sober debates following the euphoric night of 4th August, some clerical disillusionment was expressed at the National Assembly as they refused to allot compensation for the loss of the tithe. But priestly goodwill had played a major part in the fusion of the orders into a national assembly. And most ecclesiastics found it hard to believe that the spiritual life of the nation would not be promisingly regenerated by the revolution along with everything else. In the event, the clergy were to suffer even more cataclysmically than the nobility. The damage of 4th August went beyond the tithe. Many ecclesiastical institutions lost extensive feudal rights, and only complete dispossession of their lands a few months later eclipsed these previous losses. Meanwhile, those who gained most from the revolution, the acquirers of national lands, largely did so at the clergy's expense. Even before the oath of 1790, further irreparable losses had been sustained, not all of them material. The old corporate organization of the Gallican Church, self-governing and self-taxing, had disappeared in effect well before the civil constitution of the clergy pronounced its death warrant. Nothing like it was restored by the Concordat. Monasticism was also doomed by 1790, and although many monks seem to have welcomed release from their vows, France's 45,000 nuns were almost unanimous in opposing the dissolution of their convents. In the world, complained the Carmelites of the Diocese of Paris, people like to say that the monasteries are full of victims, slowly consumed by regrets. But we protest before God that if there is true happiness on earth, we enjoy it in the shelter of the sanctuary. The Concordat made no provision for the restoration of the cloistered life, and although monastic orders did not reappear, they never proliferated as they had under the old order. And meanwhile, the oath and its various successors had torn the clergy apart. Those who refused it, and therefore resisted the revolution, suffered most. Deprived of their benefices, refractories soon became pariahs in the eyes of patriots, a subversive influence wherever they operated, and once war began a treasonable one. Priests were the first victims of the September massacres of 1792. In addition to the 223 slaughtered then, the almost 1,000 were condemned in the terror, while nearly 25,000 Almost 1/6 of the whole clergy immigrated or were deported. Since 90% of clerical émigrés were seculars, the loss of parish clergy was not far short of a half. By 1794, even the constitutional clergy were under suspicion, having faced repudiation by Rome and the majority of the French population apparently for nothing. Some found belated vindication under the Concordat, but for others, the break with Rome that their oath-taking signified could not be healed, and they soldiered on into the 19th century in an ever-dwindling little church. The French clergy had been forced by the Revolution into a bitter, tragic schism, its pain only compounded by the outrages of dechristianization. The depth of the trauma was vividly expressed by an Italian cardinal as the Sacred College discussed the last details of the Concordat.
"Oh God," he agonized, "what will a government do which, after having proscribed the Catholic religion, after having persecuted it by the most scandalous laws, after staining itself with the blood of so many martyrs, today reopens the door to it not as the dominant religion, but as the religious opinion of the majority of the people, not out of love, but out of fear, not from respect, but from policy. Meanwhile, it desires it stripped and naked, with rare ministers in its pay, ministers appointed by the government itself, ministers who, in the past, have fed the flames, ministers who are supposed to pass for Catholics, yet are the authors of schism, neither repentant nor reconciled. And, in contrast, we see legitimate pastors, confessors of the faith of Jesus Christ, exiled from their homeland, separated from their flocks, religious, hounded out from the whole of that great empire, holy virgins without refuge, chapters in seminaries without the means to subsist, temples which, after profanation, remained soiled and ruinous, foundations, pious works, prerogatives, and immunities abolished and destroyed. In a word, a soulless, bloodless, powerless skeleton. That is the shadow of a religion being reestablished in France. And those who thought up this sorry project are glorying in it and usurping the title of restorers of the altars.